Hello Rolling Solo community, my name is Adam Smith, and today I will not be doing any playthroughs and you will not be seeing just my hands on camera. I wanted to start up a series of videos that I think will be quite interesting, as I really want to engage with the Rolling Solo community more often, not necessarily just on camera, although this is awesome. I have nothing against being on camera. I actually think it's quite awesome to be able to put myself on camera and put a face to the channel itself, as I typically, like I mentioned, just do everything with my hands or voice. But I really wanted to kind of start a series that was really around just kind of discussing or potentially picking preferences around different things in tabletop gaming and or the solo community, or games themselves that are more of a preference-based choice. So for instance, in this video, I've chosen to go ahead and talk about really the building out of the game board itself in a particular game. In this case, we're going to talk dungeon crawlers and adventure games. So in a dungeon crawler and adventure game, as most people have experienced and probably played at least one before, you're typically thrown into an environment tile of some shape or form. It could be on a card, it could be a tile, it could be all kinds of different things. But essentially, your character's standing somewhere. It's usually in a dungeon, in a mine, something like that. And they're going to go traverse through it. Now, what I wanted to know from you guys, and the first thing I'm going to say is the biggest disclaimer, is take away every game you're thinking of in your head around dungeon crawlers and adventure games and throw them to the side. Then take away all the design choices of what you think a designer may have put around a game for this particular question, or the reasoning around this question, and chuck that to the side for a second. That'll make more sense when I get into the details. But what I'm trying to get down to is, if someone came up to you and said, I'm going to go ahead and design a game, it's going to be a dungeon crawler adventure game, and I have two ways I could go here. The first way is I can put the party on a starting tile and give them beyond a narrative and everything else that you get at the beginning of a dungeon crawler, I'm not going to give them a map as to how the dungeon is laid out. They're going to explore that dungeon on their own, run into things as they find them, and run into the surprises, pitfalls, positives, negatives, all that good stuff as they go. Or are you going to turn around and say, you know what, I'm actually going to hand the party a map from the beginning. It's not going to lay out every detail of where all the monsters and chests and all the positives could potentially be, and negatives. But it will show them the boundaries of the game itself. So it'll let them know, like, you can go into the main room. There's 4 rooms connected to that. There's 1 corridor, and that's it. So at least they have an idea as to, how they're going to strategize. So really, it's kind of a surprise or strategize kind of approach in terms of game design, right? And that's kind of why I said take the games that you're thinking of, and of course there's lots of games that fall into the dungeon crawler bucket that are immediately going to make you say, well, I prefer this one over this one because I usually play XYZ in terms of the different games and they land in this camp. Take that all out of the equation and just answer the question from the standpoint of, do you prefer to be surprised or do you prefer to strategize? Just in terms of how a scenario begins, right? Because as we know, dungeon crawlers typically begin with a party, a person, a character, something starting in a scenario in a landscape that it's either has some known information or none at all, right? And of course, stripping away the narrative piece of it, as I mentioned, both of them probably have a narrative, but they don't tell you enough about what's presently going to be happening to you in that scenario. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that. And I'm going to give you examples for both sides, because I want you to have an example of a game in your head, but don't use that example of the game to decide which one you prefer, if that makes any sense. But I'd also like to hear your thoughts around games that implement these really well. And I'm going to give you an example, I think, of 2, one for each side of the equation. The first one is the side where you're surprised. And I'm going to say that a great example of a game like that would be Shadows of Brimstone. And that's because in most scenarios that you play in Shadows of Brimstone, especially if you're playing Hex Crawl or anything like that, and the variants that they offer through that third-party created file that's on Board Game Geek, basically you start on a mine tile at the beginning of a dungeon with a party, no matter how many characters you have in that party, and you literally just move into the dungeon. You literally have no idea what you're going to run into. And it's not really, I'm trying not to specifically focus on the enemies and the chests and the different things you may find specifically on the tile, but more so the structure of the dungeon. You don't know if you're going to be walking down a corridor or you're going to be walking down a corridor for like 4 or 5 tiles before you finally enter the main room. And then once you get to the main room, it breaks out into a certain number of rooms from there. Like, you have no idea what you're about to run into. And the reason that it actually matters is usually when you're playing a dungeon crawl, you have a party. And typically the party has to make choices on whether they stick together, whether they break apart. There might be forks in the road. You might decide, okay, Joe Blow, you and her are going this way, and this guy are going this way. Whatever the case may be, you're going to make those pivotal decisions, right? And of course, if you're on the opposite side of the coin and you've been handed a map to the entire dungeon, and you can look at the map and go, okay, so it's designed like this. Most of the rooms are on the right-hand side, so maybe we'll send the majority of the people over to the right-hand side, and we'll send one person off to the left to kind of cover the small things on that side, right? So it's about strategizing. It's about looking at the actual game state and going, okay, how are we going to tackle this, right? Having that information up front. It's kind of obvious, right? But it still begs the question, which is preferred? Which one do you prefer? And I think for Shadows of Brimstone is a great example of one of those ones that you just don't understand what is coming your way at all. Now on the flip side, which is the map laid out dungeon where you have the whole structure laid out, you know everything that way. A good example of that will probably be Gloomhaven, because literally you can open up the book to any of the scenarios and it literally gives you like, oh, okay, look, giant, huge main room, 3 rooms off to the right, 1 room on the left. There's a corridor you have to go through first to get to the main room. Once you're in the main room, then it looks like there's just 4 rooms to cover, so we could all potentially split it. Like, it provides enough information that based on the number of characters you're controlling, whether solo or with other people, you could sit there and say, okay, well, we can strategize now. And this is the reason I said to take the games and the game design out of your thought process, because for Gloomhaven, I think is a great example of a game that I think if they did it as a surprise mentality where you just don't know what's coming next, it would be a literal nightmare. And it's because of the fact that the way Gloomhaven is designed, knowing the structural layout of the dungeon is really important, because you have a hand of cards. You are doing hand management through the entire game. That is your life, and you can't just burn through cards on a whim. So knowing the dungeon layout helps you to know how well are you traversing through the dungeon in terms of progress from front to back, or whatever kind of crazy path you're going to make through that dungeon. How much of a chance, at least in your mind, you think you might have to finish that particular scenario, right? It really does help with that. For me personally, I'll tell you which one I prefer. Again, stripping away any games from the equation that I've talked about already, I prefer to be surprised, as I've probably already alluded to earlier in the video. Long story short, there's many games that fall into either camp or either side, and there's probably another camp I'm not even thinking about. What do you prefer? Do you prefer to go in blind and be surprised, or do you prefer to go in with a map essentially and strategize? And then after you've answered that without any other criteria and strings attached, then let me know what games you kind of prefer that are maybe the opposite of the choice that you like. So for instance, if you like the idea of going into a dungeon completely surprised every single time, but then at the same time you also love games like Gloomhaven, let me know those types of games that you love. I'd love to know that. I think that'd be really interesting, because it just goes to show that even though players have preferences, those preferences can literally be changed and shifted by the game design itself, if it actually makes logical sense to do so. So just a couple thoughts I wanted to throw out there. And of course, this doesn't sum up every single aspect and every single trail of this conversation. I'm sure it could be endless, but I just kind of wanted to throw something out to you guys and have a discussion. And then of course, maybe in the next little bit here, we'll throw something on the Rolling Solo Facebook community. If you're not part of that, definitely jump in, and also the Discord community too. I might be posing questions in there, just to try to see if there's other topics or other, preference-based questions that we could potentially ask and discuss. Because I just love to figure out more even about the community here, and to figure out what people prefer overall, or what they prefer in their games and that kind of thing. Because I think it'd just be cool. And I'm always going to, in these videos, also let you know my preference, so that you actually have that going out before you answer with your own. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully this was interesting. It definitely is different for me because I feel like I should be turning around right now and doing a playthrough, but I'm not. But hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. Keep on rolling solo.